Yeah, so I am a lawyer by training, and actually started my career as a First Amendment lawyer. So I represented newspapers and TV stations and radio stations at the beginning of my career. But in the late 90s, my media clients started to go online, and I ended up following them there. So for a while, I was representing media companies who had made the transition to the internet, and then eventually got the sort of internet pure play companies. And it was the early ones. It was Yahoo in 1997, right after their IPO, and companies like Hotmail and Netscape that people will now remember sort of historically because they've morphed so much. And then around 2004, I ended up going in-house to Google, which at the time was just a search engine. And my job there was to help them launch all of the projects that came after search, from Google Book Search to YouTube to Street View. So that was where a lot of my work came from. I was then at Twitter briefly before going to serve in government. So some of the things about working with small companies is they're usually working on sort of complex but new problems. And solving new problems is actually a wonderful environment. And they do that at the larger scale too, but there's just a lot more people involved at that point. I think the thing that mostly draws me to tech, and in particular tech policy, which is where I've spent a lot of my last several years, is that there are these unique challenges to technology that are not just about the technical artifact, but about how that technical thing is understood by humans, right? Whether individually or as a society. And so the things that I like to work on are where that interface between technology and humans meets. Yeah, so I was at Twitter when I got a call from the White House, which is just as nerve-wracking as you would think it would be. So I literally sat down on my front steps, which is where I happened to be standing when I got the call, and was asked to serve in the Obama administration as the deputy CTO. And as it happens, they had just called me after I was reflecting on lessons learned from my grandfather, who had recently passed away, about what it means to be a citizen in this country. And he was an immigrant. He had always been involved in his community. He and my grandmother, whether it was teaching English to recent immigrants to starting a bank that would give loans to immigrant communities when the mainstream banks wouldn't. And the overarching lesson that he taught me was that it is my right to participate in my community and my government. And if presented with the opportunity, it was both my responsibility and my privilege to do so. And so there wasn't a question for me about whether or not we would go and serve. And it was, in fact, the privilege of a lifetime to get to serve in that administration. Yeah, so I worked in the Office of Science and Technology Policy. And that is led by a director who's sort of informally known as the President's Science Advisor. And my boss was the Chief Technology Officer at the time, Todd Park. So we worked across the Executive Office of the President to try and give them good information about how technology works and its policy implications. I was lucky, though, that a lot of the work that I got to do was actually what they call interagency, meaning that I worked with a number of agencies in terms of particular policy areas. I met frequently with the chief privacy officers for all of the agencies, and that was wonderful work. So it was sort of an across government as well as within the Office of Science and Technology Policy. Under Todd Park, the Office of the Chief Technology Officer is to make good technology policy for the government at large. Todd's focus was, let's bring more fabulous technologists into government. And so US Digital Services, 18F, what became the Tech Transformation Office, those were started by Todd and Jen Polka and other folks who were working out of OSTP. in addition to that sort of how to make government work better from a technology standpoint, we also had deputies who specialized in certain areas. So there was a deputy who specialized in telecom, and at the time, net neutrality was a large piece of public debate. My portfolio was internet, innovation, and privacy policy. And at the time that I arrived in DC, it was right when the disclosures by Edward Snowden started. So the biggest question that I had during my tenure there was really, what is the US government's position going to be with regards to signals intelligence? It was like one of the big turning points, right? About how people thought about government's surveillance. And we've had moments where we thought about it, but like this, I think, brought it very close to home for a lot of people. And it was definitely a change in how technology companies started to interact with government. They might have thought of them as irrelevant or in the way, but now they were in a really different position with regard to government. You kind of always, whenever you walk through the gates of the White House, are always proud to work in government. At least I was, because I always felt like there were really amazing people doing extraordinary things at scale, right, to make people's lives better. And so it's hard to say there was one thing. I think during the time I was there was during the time that the healthcare.gov failure happened, where the website that we were hoping to launch in order to enroll people into the Affordable Care Act basically failed on launch for a whole bunch of reasons. And amazing people both inside the government, but also we were able to recruit people from the private sector to come in and like a SWAT team and fix it, so that, while it was off to a slow start, we ultimately exceeded the number of people that we had targeted to enroll, giving, like, for the first time, 20 million Americans healthcare for the health insurance for the first time. And that's a tremendous thing for government to have done. One of the things that was also really meaningful to me, but which is a little less tangible maybe, is that after we finished looking at the implications of using big data for signals intelligence, President Obama asked a task force to look at what are the overall public policy implications of big data. And so we embarked on like a 90-day study led by John Podesta and the science advisor, John Holdren, to really examine, if we're going to be using large data sets with huge computation ability, how should we be thinking about that in terms of government? What should we do or not do with it? And there were a number of things that came out of that. One of the things that I thought was really important for what is now the ongoing debate is that there is, agreed upon by almost anyone who thinks about it, a real asymmetry of power between those that collect and use data and the individuals they take it from. And I think that when we talk about privacy debates and the use of data, whether it's in the private or the public sector, that's a really important keystone to keep in mind about what our responsibilities are. And so I was actually really proud to be a part of a conversation that was not just like, oh, let's just announce something that'll make everybody feel better, that we're thinking about it, but actually it leaned into some really hard social questions. And I thought that was like a sophistication and a nuanced government discussion that was really worthy of the problem. I know others talk about sometimes like they rolled out something and like veterans got their benefits, or those weren't really the topics that I was working on. But I do feel like we laid a lot of groundwork from some of that, particularly like data and privacy conversation, so that we gave a language in public policy circles to some really hard questions. So that asymmetry of power around data was one. I think another one that came out of the big data report was an understanding that data issues are not just privacy issues. And I think that up to about 2014, that's how most people conceived of, like, well, if you have a lot of data, we should just protect people's privacy and make sure no one's compromised. So we could anonymize it, or we could, make sure that we're only collecting certain types of data. But one of the questions we looked at was, is the use of the data fair to the person being impacted on it by it? And that's not a privacy question, right? Fairness and privacy are not equivalent. And so the things you use to address those problems are different. And I feel like that's a continuing conversation, even now, 6 years on, that people are both wrestling with, but is an important part of a conversation on the design and the use of data systems. And I think that to me feels like it's gonna continue to be a benefit from the work that was being done when I was there. I'm doing a version of what I did before, which is I continue to provide strategic consulting services to a number of tech companies, trying to help them think about their place in the landscape. And I think that honestly, it's different than when I left government. I think that people who work in tech often think about their technology in isolation. And what they need to do is think about that technology as living in our cities and among people and in our communities. And so some of the work that I do now is really trying to help companies identify the principles around what their product is for and how they'll exist outside of the pure technical infrastructure. I was very thankful to be able to serve my government, but feel like I was so enriched by it, by understanding how government approaches problems and when that can be changed and when we actually have to build things that get around it, right? I also think that like one of the things that you learn in government is you're trying to help people at a scale that is enormous. And so you have to build for a really wide spectrum of people. I think that a lot of technologies get built around a very specific market. And so they're not thinking about the secondary effects of the wider use by people. And I think it may not be where they end up going as a business, but it's one of the things they ought to be considering. One of the things I would say is the thing that my grandfather's lessons echo in my ears, which is, if you are a citizen of this country, then it is not only your right to participate in government, but when you get the opportunity and when you have the skills that are so needed, it's both your responsibility and your privilege to do so. And there is so much room right now for technologists in government to help modernize our infrastructure, to help them think in more sophisticated ways about how technology lives in our society. And you shouldn't pass up that opportunity. Yeah, I mean, so some of the technologies are not cutting edge, right? We are not trying to launch a rocket. We are trying to make systems work that deliver Social Security benefits, that deliver veterans benefits, that make sure that people in low-income areas have food on their table because they need SNAP. So the reason that we need technologists in government is to figure out how to make those work. If you can order a cake from Amazon and have it delivered to your doorstep in 2 hours, then there is not a reason why a single mother should have to take a day off of work to go stand in line at a government office, right? That should be just as easy as ordering the cake. That's why we need real modern technologists to get into government, is to make the government work as well as we've now expected our private sector techs to work. Yeah, so one of the things we've discovered with the COVID crisis, but there are longstanding problems, right, is that there's some really basic things that aren't working well. So for example, when the government tried to send out stimulus payments to lots of people to make sure that they could get through this period of COVID, they actually ended up sending $1.4 billion to like over 1 million people who were dead, because they didn't scrub their list against a Social Security list of dead people. There's no need to have that happen, right? That's just a matching list. So like there are some things that need to be done that are not gonna be like going to the moon, but are enormously important to help Americans, right, across the country put food on their table and keep their rent checks up, right? All of those things. So there's lots of work to be done. And that's just one example of all the things that we're finding that particularly in this remote environment, just aren't working very well. It is such a hard question. Would you go work for an administration you didn't agree with? I think that's a really complicated question, and it's a very personal question. And so to me, it matters very much what you're asked to work on. That there are some places in government where literally you're just making things work for the American people, right? And there's all sorts of reasons to believe that continues to be a noble thing to do. There are other places in government where you can do harm, where they will not align with either American values or your values. And so you should choose wisely, because there's a lot of power in making those things work when they may be harmful to others.